The Tanakh is actually a contrived word. There are 3 words for 3 different sections in the Hebrew Bible: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. Torah actually has 2 proper meanings, but it also has a further spiritual meaning. Torah can refer to literally the law of Moses, and that would be the most specific term for it. The law of Moses is the Torah, the covenant of God. But the first 5 books of the Bible are called the books of Moses, because Moses is supposed to have written them. Torah can also mean the 5 books written by Moses. Torah can also mean something a little bit more spiritual. I remember it was 2005 when I was flying to Israel for the archaeological season. I was flying out of JFK, and I got to sit next to an Orthodox rabbi for like 12 hours or something, and it was actually a delightful experience. I learned so much. We were talking about Torah. And Torah, of course, is the revelation of God to his people, firstly in the Mosaic covenant, but obviously throughout all of the ages in many, many different ways. God's revelation is much bigger than just the revelation in the Torah, but also in a very subjective sense in every person's life. Their faith is in God's revelation to them in their life. And so when this rabbi was talking about, he would say, like, I'm living Torah. What he meant was not that I'm keeping all the rules of the law perfectly or anything like that. He meant that his whole life revolved around the revelation of God, God's desire to reveal himself, not just in the Torah, not just throughout history, but even in this rabbi's own life. His whole life revolved around the revelation of God. And so he had a much deeper meaning for Torah. When we get to the Greek period, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which are often called the books of Moses, in Greek are called the Pentateuch. Pent is a prefix for 5, just like pentagon or pentagram, or as we talked about before, Pentecost, 50 days after Passover. So if you're using Torah to describe the first 5 books of the Bible, then Torah means the same thing as Pentateuch. Good. The Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, has that name because it takes the first letter of 3 sections of the Bible. There's another section that has all of the writings of the prophets, and they call it the prophets, which a Navi is a prophet. When you add the im, it makes it plural. Nevi'im are the books of the prophets. And then any of the books that don't fit in those 2 categories are in a 3rd category they just call the writings, the Ketuvim. And that's the divisions in the Hebrew Bible. So they take the first letter of each of these Hebrew words, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, and they form this word out of them, Tanak. So this is the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. The Tanakh has the same canonical writings as the Protestant Christian Old Testament. So if you're a Protestant, in your Old Testament, you got the same stuff that is in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. However, it's divided up differently in 2 different ways. Number 1, the book divisions. You see here I've got Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. If you're a Christian, you know that in your Old Testament, you've got Judges, but then you've got 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, 1 Kings and 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, not in the Hebrew Bible. Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, it's all one book. The prophets Ezra and Nehemiah are together in one scroll, the scroll of Ezra and Nehemiah, and the 12 minor prophets are all together in one scroll called the Scroll of the 12. The one that you might find interesting is the genres. Now, of course, Christians recognize many different genres, and there are many different genres, if you want to get specific, in the Tanakh. But when you break them down into simply Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, some of the stuff that ends up in Nevi'im and Ketuvim is not the way Christians would see it. For instance, look at the prophets here. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, these are not considered prophetic books by Christians. But Samuel was a great prophet. He anointed the 1st and 2nd kings of Israel. Joshua is seen as being a great prophet as well. I mean, for that matter, Moses was. Go on ahead to the book of the Kings, and you see the great prophets Elijah and Elisha in the northern kingdom of Israel after the split, doing all kinds of crazy miracles and stuff. These are books that they consider prophetic because it tells you the stories of prophets. It tells you the words of prophets, the deeds of prophets. In any book that has this kind of prophetic content, they consider a prophetic book. So Christians, when they call something a prophetic book, it's usually because the whole book, or the vast majority of the book, is literally the words of the prophet, and they call that a prophetic book. Jews don't have the same kind of criteria. So there's some stuff in the prophets that we would think should go in the Ketuvim. But look at the Ketuvim. The great prophet Daniel is in the Ketuvim. Why is he not in the prophets? The great prophets in Judaism are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the rest of them are the minor prophets. In Christianity, they have 4 major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. Why do they include Daniel? Well, better question is, why do the Jews not? Well, Daniel isn't a prophet in the same sense, okay? First of all, the oldest copies of the book of Daniel we can find are actually 2nd century BCE, and that's when the book of Daniel was mass-produced as quickly as they could, and it gave people a lot of inspiration in a particular military conflict that was taking place at the time called the Maccabean Revolt. And we'll talk about that when we get just a little bit farther in the timeline. But the bigger reason may be that, remember our definition of prophet? Daniel is never actually sent to his people with a message, thus says the Lord, go tell my people, thus says the Lord. Daniel is a young man who's taken captive in the Babylonian exile, and Daniel actually sees a whole bunch of crazy apocalyptic visions with a whole bunch of symbolism in them that Christians, and many Jews too, believe are visions of the end of the world as we know it, before this great change, this restoration to the paradisal kingdom, whether heavenly or on earth or whatever. And so as such, these are not written for the people in Daniel's time. In fact, these stories have such crazy symbolism, it is a little difficult to understand them. And there's one point where Daniel prays to God, what does all this mean? And the angel Gabriel comes to him and says, seal up the scroll, for the time is not yet. In other words, the things that he's been shown refer to a future generation, and these words are going to be meaningful to them. But these are not visions that are supposed to translate into any kind of a message that you are supposed to take as a prophet to the current generation that is in captivity in Babylon. And so that is another reason why Daniel is kind of on a different footing than some of the other prophets. Now, Christians, of course, they consider him a great prophet because a lot of Christianity is focused on eschatological teachings about the last days, and a lot of these teachings in Daniel, we call them apocalyptic teachings because he's revealing symbolic fashion at least things that are going to happen in the last days. And so that makes it very important to Christians, especially those that believe in this eschatological period and who might believe that it's coming soon. So you don't need to know all of this stuff I've told you. Here's what you really do need to know. You do need to know that the Tanakh is the same thing as the Hebrew Bible, and it has the same writings as the Protestant Christian Old Testament, but they're divided up differently, both by genre and in terms of book divisions. Last thing, why am I saying Protestant and not Catholics? Blast ahead just a bit. The final canonical revision of the Tanakh happens near the end of the 1st century CE, okay, in the 90s. And at this point, there's an awful lot of books that people consider to be inspired and authoritative, but not all of them make it into the Jewish Bible, into the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Old Testament. But what happens is centuries later, when the Christian church, and by the way, the Catholic Church is all there is. We don't have the different divisions at this time. The Catholic Church is the worldwide, Catholic means universal, by the way, the worldwide church. The Catholic Church actually takes many of these books that were judged to be non-canonical and adds them back into their Old Testament in a special section called the Apocrypha. And so these are the books that they're not of the same, spiritual authority as the other books, but the Catholics considered them important enough to add back into their Old Testament in that special section. So if you're a Catholic, your Old Testament is much bigger than the Protestant Old Testament. And by the way, a lot of these books that are added back in there are fall in one of two categories. Either they're just too late, they were written too late to for the people to feel like they had the same kind of authority, or a lot of them fall in the category of apocalyptic books that are talking about this cosmic battle between good and evil that's going on and how it's going to play out in the last days. And they were very popular because people who are going through very hard times, oppression, persecution, anything like that, love apocalyptic writings. And most of them are written during times like that. Why? Because it relativizes your own sufferings. It says that the reason that you are going through these hardships in life, the reason you're being persecuted or, evil is seeking to destroy you, is because you're part of the chosen community. and this cosmic battle that's going on between good and evil, you're being affected by it. But here's the good news. You're part of the chosen community. Oh my gosh. And we win. It gives you a reason to be grateful in the midst of your sufferings because they mean something more than just the fact that life sucks. So apocalyptic writings are very, very popular in times of crisis when people are being oppressed, opposed, persecuted, and so on. At this point, we're going to go on to our historical slide, and we're going to fill in some gaps here. Again, this is what we call the Second Temple period. So once the temple is completed, it says Torah is reinstated here. Second Temple completed 515. So it takes them a few decades to get it all done. The Second Temple certainly is not as glorious as Solomon's Temple. They're not coming back very rich, so there's no gold-plated walls or anything at this point in time. After the Persians, Alexander the Great, the Macedonian, leads the Greek armies and spreads the Greek Empire, well, as far as he can before he finally gets ill and dies. And his kingdom is split between 4 of his generals. The 2 pseudo-Greek kingdoms, or sub-Greek kingdoms, if you will, that concern us are the one in Egypt we call the Ptolemies. You see this on the 4th line here. Starts with that silent P. And but these are the Egyptian Greeks, and the Seleucids, which are in Syria. Now, Syria is just north of Judea, and we're going to call it Judea now because the Greek language, Alexander is spreading the Greek language all over the lands that he conquered, as well as Greek culture and Greek philosophy, Greek religion, Greek arts, and so Greek culture has a huge, huge effect in Judah here. Judah, Judea, same thing. Judea is first ruled, after Alexander, first ruled by the Egyptian Greeks, the Ptolemies. Later on, the Seleucids actually take control. And the interesting event here is an event where Antiochus IV, and some people call him Antiochus Epiphanes, because he actually goes into the temple in Jerusalem and desecrates it. First of all, no Gentile's supposed to go into the holy place, or the Holy of Holies, and they're supposed to stay in the court of the Gentiles. And he goes in and declares himself to be some kind of god and sets up some kind of idolatrous image. And actually, even in the outer court, sacrifices a pig on the altar. And of course, pig is considered an unclean animal to Jews. And so anyway, the whole temple area is defiled. And ritual cleanliness, as we talked about, I introduced the idea in Hinduism, but it's really huge in Judaism. And so the whole temple has been defiled. It's ritually unclean. They have to go through a great deal of work here to re-sanctify the temple before the priests can begin to do the daily rituals again. And this is considered to be very, very important that they do these daily rituals that are supposed to keep them in covenant with God. So when this Syrian king defiles the temple, that is really the last straw for a Levitical family, a Levite family, called the Hasmoneans. We nicknamed them the Maccabees, which means the hammers. So what happens is they start a revolt against the Seleucids, the Syrian Greeks, who have defiled their temple in Jerusalem. And strangely enough, they win. They actually do defeat the Syrian Greeks. So there is a great festival that takes place when they rededicate the temple. It's usually called the Feast of Dedication, but if you want to be more precise, you could call it the Feast of Rededication, because they're rededicating the temple after they have ritually cleansed it, from the desecration of Antiochus IV. This feast is also sometimes called the Festival of Lights, because they light the menorah that is in the holy place, not the Holy of Holies, but the holy place where the priests do their ministering every day. It's one of the holy artifacts there. And when they relight it, they only have enough oil for a day, but somehow miraculously the oil lasts for 8 days. And so it's called the Festival of Lights because of the relighting of the menorah. Today, we call it Hanukkah. Now, this is actually mentioned in the Gospels, but in the Gospels, when you see it, it's called the Feast of Dedication. Hanukkah is, in a sense, not a biblical holiday, because in the Tanak and in the Protestant Old Testament, it's not featured. It's too late. It's 2nd century BCE. Target date here, as you see, 165 BCE. But it is featured in the Apocrypha. In fact, 2 of the books of the Apocrypha are 1st and 2nd Maccabees, which tell the story. Now, something else happens here that's interesting, and I'm going to explain it quickly. First of all, let me say this. In the tribe of Levi, there are rankings of families. The highest ranking families are the ones who are the head priests, the main priests at the temple in Jerusalem, and the highest ranking family we call the high priests. So the high priests and certain other families that are very high ranking are always there working at the temple. But the majority of the tribe of Levi, we call Levites, are priests only a couple weeks a year. They have a rotation, and they may have some other job, maybe have a farm or something, I don't know, but a couple weeks a year they will actually go and do their duty at the temple, after which they will travel back to wherever they live. And the high priestly family, since the time of David and Solomon, has been a family called the Zadokites, because they're all descendants of a man named Zadok, which was the high priest in the time of David, one of the two high priests in the time of David, and the ranking high priest in the time of his son Solomon. And so his descendants were always supposed to be the high priestly family. Now, while the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees were a high-ranking family, they were not the highest-ranking family, but because they were Mashiach, in other words, they were the ones anointed by God to bring about this great victory over the Syrian Greeks, they actually assume the position of the high priests. And nobody could be more upset about that, of course, than the Zadokites who are being deposed. While there is a debate among scholars, I'm part of the camp that is solidly convinced that these deposed Zadokite priests are the ones who come to the conclusion, heresy, we've got to be in the last days, and so they actually move out and start a renunciant monastic community on the northwest shores of the Dead Sea at a place called Qumran. And they are actually the ones that are copying the different books of the Bible and many other important scrolls. When the revolt from 66 to 70 CE is coming to an end and the Romans have defeated the Jews, destroying the temple in Jerusalem, and they're coming to destroy all of the other Jews that are holding out in the wilderness there in Qumran and other places. You might have heard of the last siege of Masada. But these scribes at Qumran, these priestly scribes at Qumran, they actually take the copies of all these precious documents and they seal them in ceramic containers and they hide them in all of the natural occurring caves in the Marl Terrace around Qumran, so that the Romans will not destroy them when the Romans destroy the Qumranites, the Zadokites, the people of this community. We didn't start finding the Dead Sea Scrolls until 1948, so they were there for almost 1900 years, and it revolutionized our knowledge of late Second Temple Judaism. And so a lot of the things, some of the things I've already taught you, but a lot of the things I'm going to be teaching you now are things I could not have taught you because we did not have this wealth of new information about the different sects and the different religious ideas of these different sects in the late Second Temple period. So these Hasmoneans that kick out the Syrian Greeks and take over the high priesthood, now it's Hasmonean high priesthood instead of Zadokite, and the Zadokites, of course, protest this. They have all kinds of reasons for being critical of the new regime. The way Israel was originally set up, there's supposed to be a king who comes from the tribe of Judah, who is a descendant of great King David and of Solomon. And the king that's supposed to come and reset up God's kingdom is supposed to be a descendant of David. And the person who is supposed to be the high priest is supposed to be a descendant, well, according to the Zadokites, of Zadok. In the Zadokites' eyes, the Hasmoneans have done two things very, very wrong. First of all, they have not found an heir of David and put this heir of David back on the throne. They have made themselves kings. And you might have heard the term the Hasmonean priest kings. And the second abomination, of course, is that the high priest is not supposed to be the king. These are two separate holy vocations. They're not fighting each other, they're supposed to work together, but still, the person who leads the armies into battle, for instance, is not supposed to be the same person that goes into the Holy of Holies and performs rituals before God for the removal of sins. These are two different vocations. So the Hasmonean priest kings, they take them both upon themselves, and the Zadokites that are deposed consider this to be a major blasphemy. When the Romans take over, they install a new king who's called Herod the Great. He's actually a half-Jew, but he has gone to Rome and has petitioned and successfully gotten Caesar to name him as king. When the Romans take over, Yes, they are deposing the high priests. They can't be called kings anymore, but they do leave them in power over the temple. And they do leave them as the controlling party within the Jewish government called the Sanhedrin. Why do the Romans do that? Because they're smart. They don't want to micromanage. If you've got a government that people respect, especially if they're religious leaders and have the power of religious legitimation, that means to tell you what God wants you to do politically, make them your friends, leave them in control. So they leave the high priests in control of the temple and the Jewish government. But the big responsibility the high priests have in this regard is to convince the people that it is God's will that they submit to the Romans, that they obey the Romans, that they pay their taxes to the Romans, and that they are good Roman citizens and don't start any rebellions against the Romans. So the high priests are supposed to convince the people of this. And because of this, the high priests don't like any messiahs coming that are going to restore the kingdom. Because if they're unsuccessful in eliminating these messianic movements and a rebellion does break out that turns into a war against Rome, the Romans are going to come and destroy the high priests and take away their power. And, that will be their reward if they cannot do their job. And as we're going to find out in this very next section here, their political agendas have a lot to do with their religious theology as well. One last thing before we move on, and that is, even though Rome has taken over, the effects of the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great are still widespread. You'll hear the term sometimes the Hellenistic period in Judaism. Well, Hellas just means Greece. It's the ancient term for Greece. So Hellenistic means Greek. But in terms of Judaism, it's talking about Greek cultural, philosophical, religious, social influences on Judaism. And one of the things I want you to know is that the language, the main language in the Roman Empire is still Greek in most of the empire. And the reason is Alexander the Great has spread that language everywhere. And in any of the nations that used to be parts of the Greek Empire, any people that are involved in business with someone outside of their country or, have political positions or whatever, they speak at least two languages, at least. They speak their own dialect, the language of their people in their locality, and they speak Greek. They've got to speak Greek to be involved, again, in politics or business with anyone that is from a different area. The whole New Testament of the Bible is written in Greek. Even the soldiers that speak Latin in Italy are going to have to speak Greek when they're in nations that don't know Latin. So Greek is the more widespread language. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about Mashiach, Messiahs, the messianic expectations that exist in the time of Jesus. And then we're also going to talk about sects in late Second Temple Judaism. So I'll see you then.